All right, so we're starting off this webcast today with John, one of your pictures, and I'll let you get to this in just a minute. But thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm Shannon Blankenship, Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, joined by my co-host Jimmy Orth at St. John's Riverkeeper to talk about river rising solutions. Today's solution, we're going to be discussing tributaries, specifically ecological restoration and natural channel design, linking that to this idea of rising waters and solutions to rising waters. We're going to be joined by guest expert John Kiefer, Principal Water Resources Engineer at Wood Inc. Today, we're going to cover the connection between tributaries in the St. Johns River. We're going to talk about how tributaries and specifically natural channel design are related to localized and downstream flooding. And then we're going to end with viewer comments and questions. So for everyone that's tuned in on Zoom, thank you for joining and feel free to stick around for that. For anyone who's watching on Facebook, hi, and visit stjohnsriverkeeper.org if you want to tune in to be able to ask John questions live on our Zoom today. But first, oh man, I always forget this slide. First, Jimmy, would you mind telling folks why we're here and why we're doing this River Rising Solutions web series?
Yeah, just briefly, I know some of you have tuned in before, but just want to make sure you're aware of St. John's Riverkeeper. We are a nonprofit advocacy group for the St. John's River, and some people have characterize that as a watchdog group for the river. And so our job is really to advocate for policies that are going to be protective of the river, making sure that our laws, regulations, and rules are being adequately implemented and enforced, and also seeking solutions like we're going to talk about today. So we advocate for a lot of solutions that will help protect our river. We also, obviously part of our role is we have to engage the public. So we do a lot of outreach to try to get the public involved in the work that we do. And we also have an education team that goes into the schools and does a lot of programming with kids, trying to prepare the next generation of advocates. And so that they're more aware of the St. John's River and more connected to it. That's one of the things we really stress in our education and in our outreach programs is connecting people to the river, getting them out there to experience it, because we feel like experiencing the St. John's is so critical to caring about it and advocating for it. And so that's some of the things that we do. But one of the issues that is really important to us is obviously the impact of rising waters from sea level rise, and of course the impact from climate change. And several years ago, when Hurricane Irma hit hit really a lot of cities and impacted a lot of cities throughout the watershed, but particularly Jacksonville, it was kind of a wake-up call for the impacts that these storms can have on our communities, but also more importantly, the impacts they can have on our St. John's River. Each of these storms is essentially an unmitigated pollution event. When we have flooding, a lot of chemicals and pollutants make their way into the St. John's River. So we did a town hall series that was really about River Rising town hall series that was connecting people, raising awareness about how deepening the river also makes these problems worse, but also the impacts that we are going to face in the future from sea level rise and climate change. And through that, what Shannon and I decided the next step was we really need to start now talking about the solutions and how do we actually resolve some of these problems and create a more resilient community in Jacksonville and more resilient communities throughout the watershed. So that's why we're here today, and we're really excited to have Dr. Kiefer with us.
So in having this sort of mission to protect the St. Johns River and having this vision for a thriving St. Johns River watershed, that's more than just the main stem. And as an organization, we have always fought to protect not just the main stem, but the tributaries, the wetlands, the lands that are connected to the watershed, because in and of itself, the St. Johns River is only the sum of its parts. And the end point of many of the smaller creeks and streams that enter into the St. John. So if we're not thinking about the headwaters of those creeks and streams, then we can't do a good job at effectively protecting the St. John's River as we all see it and we all know it itself. In discussing climate change issues and concerns, when people talk about sea level rise, they often think specifically about the coast, about the ocean, maybe about the estuary in the St. Johns River where the Atlantic meets the St. Johns. But often they're not thinking about how sea level rise or how specifically tributaries are being impacted by climate change. So we're going to cover some of that today. We're going to be able to talk about that and really sort of holistically understand what's going on and understand it as a solution. One tributary in particular that we can almost use as a case study at this point for how this sort of, I guess, tributary analysis is unfolding is on Mccoy's Creek, which is an urban tributary in the St. Johns River watershed that flows through not just the heart of downtown Jacksonville, but really connects a lot of our urban core neighborhoods like Murray Hill, North Riverside, Brooklyn, and then enters the St. Johns underneath currently the Times Union building where it meets the St. Johns. And Mccoy's Creek is undergoing not just natural channel design, but really a change in how we're thinking about our waterways by taking it out of just a conversation in the Public Works Department and bringing in all of these co-benefit conversations from our parks and recreation folks, our transportation folks, neighborhoods, and of course, water quality and aquatic habitat, and a lot of the things that, St. Johns Riverkeeper is advocating for in order to protect the St. Johns River. So we're excited today to be able to take this Mccoy's Creek case study and learn how we can rethink that co-benefit approach. And Jimmy, wanted you to chime in here on this idea of natural channel design and how it really connects to the larger purpose of and the mission of St. Johns Riverkeeper.
Well, yeah, and let me say first, I want to say Dr. Kiefer is really intimately familiar, obviously, with Mccoy's Creek. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but also I want to give a shout out to our friends at Groundwork Jacksonville, who are spearheading this effort of restoring the creek and creating the Emerald Trail, which is going to be fantastic for all of us. So I want to give them a lot of credit for really making this happen. We've been talking about this for a number of years, St. Johns Riverkeeper included, and they are getting it done. So I really appreciate that. But I think the thing is, just kind of following up on what you said, Shannon, the tributaries are so critical. I mean, people think of the river as the main stem, but they don't realize, like, just in the lower section of the St. Johns, and that's the section of river that starts about Willaca, south of Palatka, and flows north to the Atlantic Ocean. There are over 75 tributaries just in that section of the river. And so tributaries are the key. They're the I guess you could say, the arteries, the capillaries of the St. Johns River that really are the lifeblood of ensuring that the St. Johns is healthy. And so this is an important conversation. It's something that we need to address. And unfortunately, I have to say, though, most of those tributaries are impaired. And that's, you may hear us say that from time to time, but that's I think government speak for polluted. And so it's something we need to acknowledge, that a lot of these tributaries are not healthy. And part of that reason is because in a lot of cases that we've actually altered the natural channel and the flow and hydrology of those creeks. And so in the future, we really hope that more projects like Mccoy's Creek actually come to fruition.
Well, without further ado, I wanted to introduce our guest speaker today, John Kiefer, Principal Water Resources Engineer with Wood, Environment and Infrastructure Solutions. Just a quick bio here on John, because he's got a lot of credentials behind his name, but a PhD in environmental engineering from University of Florida, a master's of science in environmental engineering from University of Florida, and a bachelor's in environmental engineering. He's very focused from UF as well. Dr. John Kiefer is an award-winning ecosystem restoration designer specializing in restoring highly altered landscapes, including surface mines, deforested areas, ditched and drained wetlands, and within the urban core. He has more than 30 years of experience in water resources and applied ecology disciplines, offering clients innovative, cost-effective solutions in ecological restoration design, hydrology assessments, and water quality improvements. He's what I think is most important here is he's been behind numerous stream restoration projects using Florida specific techniques. We know we have very unique water here in the state of Florida that he has developed with extensive original research and pilot projects. And of course, we work with John Kiefer as a partner with Groundworks Jacksonville, specifically on this Mccoy's Creek restoration. And that's why we invited him here to talk with us today about tributary restoration. John, I want to kick it over to you and just start off by asking if you can help us to understand how tributaries in the St. Johns River are being impacted by climate change.
Thank you, Shannon. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be speaking with you today on climate change effects on tributaries along the St. Johns River. I'm always excited to be able to talk about Florida streams, and as Jimmy mentioned, there's quite a large number of them, and particularly as you move downstream closer to the mouth of the river with the Atlantic Ocean, the tribs have been substantially and directly altered. Right? So some have been obliterated, some are completely bulkheaded. Some very unnatural changes to them, and I think. When you think about those alterations and then that happening on top and climate change happening on top of those direct impacts, it's a double whammy on some of these tributaries. So, and Mccoy's Creek is a good example of that. But if we look at how tributaries are impacted by climate change along the St. Johns River, it's really from two directions, one from the ocean and one from the sky. So we have your ocean effects are, your classic sea level rise that everybody thinks about, but, which is going to unfold over a period of time and change the hydrology and the salinity gradients of our tributaries. But another factor related to that is that the tidal fluctuations, the range of fluctuation in the daily tide is increasing in amplitude, right? So at the mouth of Mccoy's, 20, 30 years ago, that amplitude was less than a foot or right around a foot. Now it's almost 2 feet, right? So that doesn't sound like a lot, but from the standpoint of estuarine ecology, that's a lot. And so that changes what kind of vegetation we would have in a marsh as you move up the tributary, for example. And then the third part of that is your kind of rare, comparatively rare, potentially catastrophic storms that bring surge, right? Big tide surge up the valley, up the river, and then up some of these tributaries. So the amplitude of that surge, the severity of it, can increase as well, concurrent with sea level rise effects. So you have the ocean effects that change the ecology and can change the flood frequency of the adjacent properties. The other big thing with our tributaries, though, is that they don't only get their flow from the tidal influence of the river, the estuarine part of the river. They get their flow. A large part of their water balance is coming from runoff, stormwater runoff, and when we're talking about an urban area, that stormwater runoff is interacting with development before it reaches the creek, and can pick up all kinds of pollutants along the way. And if it's not treated, if it's an older development that was built prior to regulation, that water is getting very little treatment, if any treatment. So in many cases. But what's happening with rainfall, and this varies across the state or across the Southeast, but some general things that we're concerned about with the rainfall changes is that we're getting longer droughts, and we're getting more pronounced flooding, right? Storm intensification, bringing more water to these creek valleys when it occurs. So it's the overall volume of rainfall on an annual or long-term basis maybe isn't changing a lot, but the range of variability in that between years or even between storms is changing. So the streams are a lot of streams around the Southeast United States and Florida are seeing these effects of storm intensification, right? So areas, and McCoy's Creek is probably a good example where you have a community in retreat from increased flood frequencies, right? So McCoy's Creek in its current configuration was more adequate in the past than it is today to alleviate flooding in some of these neighborhoods. And so you've had literally some developed properties that have been abandoned in recent years as a result of this increased effect of flooding from the sky. And so, in a McCoy's Creek setting, climate change then is affecting it really from both ends, from the watershed, from stormwater, and from ocean effects at its mouth.
I think people understand this. When Hurricane Irma hit, we had so much water coming from South Florida upriver, right? And then we also had the storm surge coming in from hurricanes. But I don't think that maybe what a lot of people are realizing is that is happening in our tributaries with every single storm, with very minor storms. We have a lot of runoff, coming into these tributaries. And then we have the St. Johns River and its, tides coming up. And so when we see these localized flooding issues, we're looking at tributaries as the cause, but it's really, just a lot of different things happening hydrologically, and therefore, a lot of potential solutions in that, and wanted to give you a chance to say, so what is natural channel design? How does natural channel design fit into how we're seeing this, sort of alteration of our ecosystems?
Okay, so one of the big issues with a lot of urban creeks is that they either never, when they were altered, never did fit the watershed conditions, because the watershed was altered, and in some cases the creek itself was altered, right? So, and usually for very specific purposes to promote livability of that landscape, but there wasn't a lot of thought in terms of, well, are we modifying the water body in a way that can meet multiple objectives other than just maybe some flood relief or just getting water off the landscape as quickly as possible. And so, so a lot of the natural form in our creeks was sacrificed. So we straighten them, we bulkhead them, and that has happened to McCoy's Creek. We relocate them. In fact, McCoy's Creek was relocated to the south from where it used to be, and its former wetland was filled in. When we talk about natural channel design, we're really trying to design or retrofit a new flow corridor along the old one that harnesses natural processes and materials available to it from the watershed rather than resisting them. Right, so that's the distinction: is harness rather than resist, tap nature, and in a way that enables that part of the valley to create a self-sustaining ecology. And then from that, what we're really doing, another way to view that would be, is we're fitting the channel and floodplain, the pattern and dimension of the channel and the floodplain, to the watershed conditions. Right, so the watershed's delivering flow, sediment, pollutants, or nutrients, however you want to view that, right? But it's chemistry, and developing a corridor that accommodates all of those inputs, processes them in a very natural way, without eroding, without major massive erosion. And so one strategy for this is to, essentially it's thinking in terms of giving the creek what it needs, right? So not thinking about imposing our will and deciding what the creek needs to look like based on a very narrow perspective of functions, but more answering the question: if we did nothing, if humanity stepped away and we did nothing for a long, long period of time, many decades, maybe even a couple centuries, what would this look like? So that's what I mean by giving it what it needs. And then when we take that design approach, what we're really doing is we're trying to achieve a balance of the form of the valley and with the flow and sediment it's receiving. So it's, we're able, when we do that, we can sort of attribute the valley with native plants, and then it'll be colonized by native wildlife that are adapted to these particular patterns and dimensions and flow that we're establishing in that corridor, right? So so it starts bringing in not just a drainage improvement benefit, but natural channel design is also bringing in water quality benefits, just like how natural creek systems and their floodplains transform water quality. They're and the hydrology benefits. It's balancing. In the case of McCoy's Creek, we're getting a good salinity balance reestablished in that system, and some wetland vegetation adjacent to the drainage, and then the open channel itself is great fish habitat. So we're just putting back in a pattern and a dimension to that is intrinsically stable and predictable from a wildlife standpoint, right? So they have resources that they're adapted to be able to target in their life cycles and natural creeks, and we're restoring that predictability for them, which a bulkheaded ditch doesn't necessarily provide. Right? So that's kind of the underlying concept, I think, of natural channel design. Fit it to its watershed, so it's self-organizing and self-sustaining.
I love this too, John. It's like, I think it's kind of remarkable in some ways that we're just coming around as humans to realize that we need to work with nature, not against it. Because we've obviously tried to impose our will on nature for an awful long time, and I think that's starting to catch up with us in a lot of ways. I remember hearing a quote one time. I wish I could remember it, but it had essentially was saying that nature has been engaged in research and development for thousands of years, and has it's taken thousands of years to perfect the natural processes, and here we are trying to apply knowledge that we've gained literally over potentially hundreds of years. So.
And yeah, I think with anything, Jimmy, you don't know what you don't know, and that can really bite you. So in fact, one of the things that we have to be really careful about as ecosystem restoration designers is, an acknowledgement of our biases in design, and having some self-awareness about where, our weaknesses or our biggest challenges might lie in a design. And I think, a lot of these projects have to be designed as kind of with adaptive management in mind a little bit as well. So, we're with natural channel design in the urban core, I think would be naive to simply use an existing area from wilderness as your template for design, right? Because you have some new normals now in terms of watershed, the pace and volume of flow delivered to the valley, for example, is different in the urban core than it is in a state park. So, we can learn a lot from nature, and we have, but we also have to acknowledge, what are the departures in terms of watershed function that we're getting in the developed landscape, and what aspects of those departures are likely to affect channel and or floodplain morphology and vegetation. So those are very careful considerations that have to be made in natural channel design in the urban core.
John, speaking to that, I think one of the biggest alterations we've made to our waterways is straightening them. And we've done that for a lot of reasons. In McCoy's Creek, for example, it was a canal. And so we used that waterway for industrial transportation. But in other waterways, it's, again, you get more land, right? More buildable land if you make your waterway straighter. So I want to find out specifically about reincorporating that natural meander and how that can sort of, I think, is a real big piece of the puzzle here when it comes to flooding reduction, and then the other benefits of natural meander in a waterway.
Okay. So, yeah, giving wiggle room to the creek is powerful, because if you think about, try to imagine a natural creek that doesn't meander. They're very rare. And where they do occur, they're following some kind of geologic structure that's kept them straight, a fracture in bedrock or something like that. But where a creek's allowed to meander, it does. And so there's some really compelling physics for why that occurs. And this gets at harnessing nature versus defying nature. So if we want to resist nature, we straighten things. And that means we have to import rock or concrete or steel or plastic or some combination thereof to hold it in place, keep it straight. And those items have cost and replacement and maintenance costs. And so if we want to have a system that's self-organizing and self-sustaining, a meander is almost a given, right? So there are exceptions, but it's the norm. And because creeks are moving not just water, right? So if the only thing they ever moved was water, straight would be perfectly fine. And that would be a form we would see a lot in nature. But the fact that creeks also move sediment is a big part of the reason they meander. It's because of the way sediment accumulates over time, and it forms bends and point bars and bend pools. And so creeks are really, from a physics standpoint, trying to dissipate energy and optimize the way flow and sediment both move through the valley from an efficiency standpoint. And it turns out that a meandering form is the optimal form. And Jimmy, you mentioned nature's got millennia of experimentation going in its favor. That's been the end. That was their conclusion. Was nature's conclusion is creeks should meander, and they should be meandering through a floodplain, right? So it's not just one channel. You really could view it as sort of like, you're coming down off the developed landscape, and then you have a floodplain that higher flows move through, and then embedded within that is a smaller channel that meanders through the floodplain, right? So it's what we call a two-stage channel, right? So you have a flood stage, and then you have your bank full flow or your lower flows, your normal flow going through the meandering channel. And in Florida, in general, that flood channel is very frequently carrying flow in natural systems, much more frequently than national averages. So, which might be twice every 3 years, their flood channel carries flow in temperate North America. In most Florida creeks, our flood channel is carrying flow multiple times a year. And in some of our bigger river systems, that flood channel might flow for months at a time, actually. So it's to view it as something distinctly separate from the creek is not a good way to look at it. And so when we're meandering a channel, it's imperative to think about how that's meandering through a floodplain and how the flow will interact back and forth between that channel, the main channel, and its floodplain. And if you get that wrong, you're not invoking natural channel design. You're doing something novel and probably unstable. Simply putting a squiggly ditch in place of a straight ditch is a bad idea if it's not interacting properly with a floodplain. And the meander pattern matters a lot too. It has to fit its watershed. That's a whole nother technical detail, but getting that meander pattern, the spacing of the bends, the tightness of the bends is really scaled to the watershed size and within a given hydrophysiographic region. And so is the minimum size of the floodplain you need, or the meander width. So what we're really talking about with meander, and this is probably the most important part of this, is we're in the urban core, is we have to answer this question first and foremost: how much wiggle room is necessary based on the watershed, and do we have enough room for it to accommodate it? What is the wiggle room of the stream and its floodplain? And and so that would be the, the first sort of design variable we have to consider in natural channel design in the urban core. So do we have enough room to do that?
It's interesting, John, because I think that is something that unfortunately we have not done historically, is really understanding the importance of that wiggle room, that giving nature space, and I think, we've seen that. It's evident by how we've built in floodplains for decades and decades, and then see the consequences of that now that we're seeing, where a lot of homes are flooded repeatedly, and people are impacted. We learned that actually last week when we had Dr. Chambers from University of Central Florida on talking about wetlands, and she was talking about the importance of wetlands having room, that they need to have room for migration, so they can adapt to sea level rise and climate change, but we have to give them some room. And unfortunately, the same thing happens with wetlands. We want to build right up to where we consider the delineation of the wetland, and then not giving it room. And so I think that's an important concept that we need to realize, is that nature needs space. And so.
And resiliency, we're finding, I think, that this concept of taking a layered approach to building resiliency into communities and for nature is having enough space for nature, right? Because it's not just the space we need under today's climate or today's sea level, but looking into the future and thinking about how much more we need really to accommodate storm intensification or sea level rise, and how we would like, giving nature an opportunity to respond and adapt over time to those new conditions. And so we definitely have to design with that in mind, and not just the present. And it's, as a designer, I will tell you, it's difficult, but fun to contemplate. But it does introduce a challenge to the design, to think about how much room not only do we need today, but going down the road.
Well, you're kind of expected to not only understand natural processes and how to incorporate those into a design, but also in some ways you're being asked to predict the future. So that's really challenging.
Yeah, in engineering practice, we've always had good data from the past to develop our conceptual and mathematical models for predicting the future. And we're having to make more suppositions than I think we have had to at almost any time in modern history, because of climate change. Our 30-year past climate record is no longer statistically as relevant as it once we could have assumed.
John, I've never heard a professional engineer use the squiggly ditch term before, but I'll assume that that's standard. I also have I've never seen anyone talk about, allowing squiggles in a ditch. So I definitely learned something myself today. Do you think that this idea of the space needed for, creeks to have that meander or to be able to flood, is that one of the biggest barriers to natural channel design in urban areas, or what kinds of barriers are there?
Well, yeah, so that's one of the first ones, right? So if you don't have room to accommodate natural channel design, you just check that off the list and go to your next best option. Because normally I've yet to work for a client who said, hey, we'll buy up everybody and everything we need to implement natural channel design, right? So the first question usually is, can we fit it? And if I even get that question, right? So one of the barriers, I think, is probably the limits of public imagination, right? So natural channel design is something comparatively new in many places around the world, including Florida. It's been more consistently practiced in other places. And but this fear of the unknown, right? So if it's the first time a municipality or county or private property owners implemented some natural channel design, they have lots of questions, right? And a lot of concerns, and so we have a lot of information, and demonstration projects go a long way too. So But overcoming this sort of fear of the unknown, I think, and seeing it as an opportunity rather than a concern, right? So there's that psychological barrier sometimes to overcome. And, and absence of regulation is an issue. Florida is one of the few states in the nation that doesn't have an in-kind stream mitigation requirement. So if you impact a stream, you could put it back as a wetland here. But if you impact a stream in North Carolina, you have to put it back as a stream. So an absence of regulation is actually a little bit of a, I don't know if impediment's the right word, but it hasn't released the need or demand for lots of more stream restoration. Then you have nature in Florida, right? So if we have a lot of very gradually sloped valleys, and they're not steep enough to drive enough energy to carve and maintain an open meandering channel. And the prime example of that, the biggest one, is the Everglades, right? It's the river of grass really doesn't have a meandering river through it. It's a big sawgrass marsh, and with a very, very gradual tilt to it toward the tide. And even though it has a massive watershed, it really doesn't have a valley that's confined enough and sloped enough longitudinally to drive the energy to have the Kissimmee River going through where the Everglades are today, for example. So we had to pay attention to those variables, and we can still have a flowing water body in some cases, but you're just not going to be able to have a meandering open channel. And a lot of times the valley will alternate between those two different states where you have the capacity for a meandering channel versus more of a strand or a slough that's more slowly flowing water through vegetation, often a forest. So anyway, nature plays a role in deciding where we can have it too. And then, but the main thing is property. Do you have enough undeveloped space? There was a point early in my career where I was focused almost entirely on working stream restoration projects at mine sites and rural areas because I knew I had room to work, right? And I just sort of wrote off the urban core thinking, when are you ever gonna have enough room there? And that changed when Sarasota County hired us to explore about 100 miles of canals in their county as a case study in one watershed in their county that they were managing, spending a lot of money to manage their canals. They wanted to reduce their management costs. And they knew we did natural channel design. They liked a lot of our work that they had toured at other facilities and said, does this play a role? Can you look into that? Or instead of just gabion lining everything or rip-wrapping it. So I was a little pessimistic that we'd be able to give them much good news. We took the assignment and I was blown away by the opportunity to stream restoration in that particular setting. Something like 95% of the canals, they had enough right of way to do it. And their right of ways are pretty standard. So there's other Southwest Florida counties and municipalities that are approaching us now about taking similar analyses in their jurisdictions. And almost everywhere we look, we see potential, maybe not along the entire drainage network or the entire part of a valley segment we're looking at, but we see extensive potential for it. So it really has blown me away positively that there often are a sufficient right of way. Now, a confounding factor that you can get all excited and you think you have enough room, and then you look at subsurface utilities, and then you're like forest mains or sewer lines and water lines. And where do people, where do engineers like to put these kind of lines? In undeveloped corridors. So if you already have these travelways and canals or ditches in open space, a lot of times that's where that kind of infrastructure gets placed. And so it can be very expensive to relocate it, or just might not even be possible. So that's the next thing we look at too, right? So first of all, do you have undeveloped land to do it? And then, what's underground? And because, even though that can usually be moved, it's so expensive, it would kill the economics of the project. The bridges are another major consideration. a lot of times bridges were designed with this, maybe the existing smaller ditch in mind, or and they were never designed to pass sediment appropriately. So you might want to do bridge work in concert with your creek restoration, and that adds cost and complexity that some clients may not be able. You're throwing all kinds of new stuff at them to begin with, and then you just add bridges, and it blows their mind. But there's some really powerful reasons to kind of work bridge retrofits in a very integrated fashion with your stream design, a natural channel design plan, because you can get both of them to maintain really good continuity of sediment transport together and good continuity of flood flow to reduce floods. And those are interactive, by the way. So if you can work the design that way, both creek and bridge openings together, can be really powerful and highly desirable to do it. And then the other thing we touched on, I think, is urban hydrology, right? So this, I can't design, for example, the forest in the bottomlands of the new Mccoy's Creek to be the exact same kind of forest we would have had if the watershed was undeveloped, because the development sends runoff so fast down into the valley that the peak flows and the water levels achieved in our newly contoured valley are actually going to be at depths for short durations that we would see in a much larger river. So I have to use the plant palette, species palette from a larger river, and to pick species that can tolerate those higher flood levels for those short periods of time. And so literally, the Mccoy's Creek planting palette draws from species that you would see in like the Swanee River. So we had to think of that accordingly. The other thing is we need bigger floodplains in urban creeks than we need in a rural creek draining the same size watershed. And that's what you adjust. You don't change the size of the little meandering channel. That's been tried in other parts of the country where they thought they had to make that bigger, and almost all those projects failed. What we found through human experimentation is that in urban settings, it's the floodplain that needs to get bigger, not the meandering channel. The meandering channel can be designed just like you would in a rural watershed, and should be. But so we're getting all the extra flood benefits are really coming from deepening and widening the adjacent floodplain into your travel ways or other available land adjacent to the ditch.
I'm glad, John, too, that you mentioned land use changes and how important that is, because we were talking earlier about the impacts of climate change and sea level rise on creeks, but again, as we continue to change the watershed in terms of development and increased amounts of impervious surfaces that cause more of this runoff into the creeks, we're just compounding the problem. And that's the one thing people need to realize when we're talking about 1,000 people a day moving into the state of Florida. All of those people require driveways and sidewalks and roads and rooftops and all of these things that shed that water quickly, and a lot of times convey that water much more quickly into these waterways. And that's something that we're going to have to deal with in the future as well. So I know, Shannon, you have another question. I won't digress.
Shannon, if you don't mind, just real quick, I would like to follow up on that, because I've been speaking with, fluvial geomorphologists, creek blinders on. And, because
don't we all?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, who doesn't? But but Jimmy, that's a really good point, because if you can integrate distributed stormwater treatments throughout the watershed, some people call low impact development design or green infrastructure, bioswales, rain gardens, rain barrels, just things that slow the flow down on the way to the creek and drive more of that water to enter into the soil, like it would in a rural watershed or a forest. And trees play a big role in that too, right? So they intercept some of that rainfall. And so there's a lot of approaches to green infrastructure. I like to call it distributed treatment because it's lots of little treatments throughout the watershed that have a cumulative effect on that runoff reaching your valley. And I get super excited anytime I'm involved in a stream restoration project that is concurrently being planned as part of a watershed management plan. And where we're going to be able to do these kinds of stormwater treatment retrofits throughout the watershed. And we're doing that right now for Escambia County on Carpenter Creek and Bayou Tahar, an area that just got hammered by Hurricane Sally. And one of the things that we all knew even before Sally is that we were going to be paying a lot of attention to these distributed treatments in the watershed concurrently with a stream restoration design. So that's a very powerful combination. And there's some examples around the world where you can take that far enough, the watershed treatment far enough to get the watershed to behave like it would have had it been a forest again, a natural forest. And if you can take it that far, then we can flat out mimic nature in our stream restoration design. And we don't have to make these special accommodations I was talking about earlier, like picking a Swanee River palette of plants, and sticking that into a little tiny creek like Mccoy's. So that's good stuff. I'm glad you brought that up. That's very important.
No, and Jimmy and I have been talking about these ideas a lot. Tributary restoration is literally just one of the the matrix, the full list of things that will help with solutions to rising waters. And so this, I think, I hope fits into a larger conversation. But yeah, we are totally on board with the fact that tributary restoration combined with reducing stormwater impacts through green infrastructure and low impact development and urban forests and all of these things are going to be what's necessary when you have a problem as complicated and multifaceted as climate change and what's going on with our waterways. John, I do want to give a minute to talk about, and I have an image here of the Mccoy's Creek restoration plan, because one of the things that is, I think, really unique in what we're talking about here is that in order to hold more water in Mccoy's Creek, in order to reduce flooding, people, I think that you should go deeper. But in fact, the plan is really to go wider. And then, in fact, I think in many areas, the channel itself that we're used to seeing on Mccoy's Creek won't necessarily be a defined channel anymore, and it looks different. So I wanted to give you the chance and folks to be able to see. I'm sharing more from the recreation plan side of this, design from Scape, which is your partner on this project, but maybe talk to people about what they might be seeing on Mccoy's Creek in the future, specifically because of the flooding reduction that you're trying to implement there.
Right. So this whole concept of going wider rather than deeper is an important one for people to understand. So right now, if I were to superimpose what Mccoy's Creek looks like, it's a pretty narrow ditch that just runs like this. And it's actually not very deep.
This is the existing.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Right here, right?
Yeah.
So for
right.
anyone that's familiar with the Mccoy's Creek area, the channel is just this skinny area right here. So we have a skinny, narrow Mccoy's Creek. Most people would miss it in driving by, but this is the projected plan.
Right. So now recall I was talking about having a flood channel, right? And in places where we can't have the meandering channel because the hydraulic gradient's not powerful enough, we're going to have just kind of flow that's distributed through this wetland as it works down valley. And that's what we have in this particular section here. And so flow is moving. I don't know if y'all can see my cursor, but I'm saying here, but flow is moving from your left to the right in this image. And it's flowing through a bottomland forest that we're going to excavate at a lower elevation. And that's what we mean by widening the creek, right? So it's really what we're doing is widening the floodplain more than anything else. And then it enters a an area that historically, where you see that blue channel picking up on the right side of the image, and there's a lighter green next to that. That's where we believe that long-term there'll be this transition between more of a fully freshwater forest and a legal haline marsh, or slightly salty marsh, and with what we call a river inlet channel, right? So if you're coming up from the perspective of the river, you could, take a kayak and travel through an open water body with a slight meander to it, and historically you could have taken that all pretty much to the CSX crossing that's on the far right side of this image, and we're anticipating that maybe a little bit beyond that is where that zone will migrate over time, right, as sea level rise progresses. But we have this drowned valley that ever since the glaciers started melting, during the Pleistocene. I'm not talking about human-induced climate change, but long-term sea level rise associated with post-glaciation period, has drowned some valleys that used to be exposed when sea levels were up to, I think, 300 feet lower than they are today. And so some of our inlets, if you look all up and down the St. Johns River, they're the deeper channels that really are kind of relics of the distant past and interacting with a higher modern sea level. And so the Riverkeeper was very helpful with our research in determining what the morphology of those inlets look like in areas that haven't been impacted by urbanization or filled or bulkheaded or and so forth. So when we did that research, we were able to use that data to kind of forensically determine how far upstream that inlet channel would occur on the Mccoy's Valley. And the answer was, right around the CSX crossing. So we're starting that here. And so that's kind of entering into a more tidally influenced section of our project from that point downstream. And now there we are going a little bit with the deeper channel mode. But again, wherever we can, we're also combining that with a wider floodplain. And there's some images, if we took one panel downstream, you'd see we were really broadening that marsh out. Because we had the land available to do it. Right in this, where it's necking down, we didn't have the available property because of, you can see there's buildings and a road that we need to keep open in that and confining the valley in that part. So this is a little bit upstream from where we just were, and you can see you had a little more room, so we're building a wider bottomland. And now the open water bodies you see that we're calling lagoons, we sometimes do see deep pond-like features, sort of like linear ponds within strands in Florida rivers and creeks. So this is not without natural precedent, but I will say that the main reason we're putting these in here in this location is to add interest for the community. And so we had this excellent landscape architecture team, Scape Studios, working closely with our engineers and scientists at Wood to really design a compelling recreation component into our creek restoration. And part of that was to have some of these open water body inclusions. They'll have lily pads, they'll have, they'll have marsh vegetation surrounding them, and they're otherwise embedded within a forested bottomland. But they'll also make nice places just to relax and enjoy and watch wading birds utilize the edge and do a little bit of fishing. And, so it really adds a nice component to the park-like atmosphere of the restoration.
We have a few minutes left. I want to find out if anyone from the audience, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you do want to ask a question. I'll give you the time to do that now. John, I do have, or Jimmy, do you have something final? I'm so worried that my final question is going to be like way too long, but so I want to find out if you have something final that's going to be a little quicker. Otherwise, I definitely have a final thought that I want to get John's opinion on.
Well, I didn't really have any final question, but I just, I think it's been fascinating listening to John. As a matter of fact, I thought something that we didn't talk about today, but we talked about in our prep for this webcast is I really thought it was fascinating when John was telling us that he tries to think like a mayfly or think like a fish when he's doing this. I thought, man, I don't think I've ever heard an engineer really talk that way about really trying to put themselves in the place of these macroorganisms and these. So anyway, I think that's really cool, John. And I think that, you know, this is really exciting, frankly, the work, and we're really fortunate to have you doing this work in Jacksonville. Excited about what Groundwork is doing. And I can't wait. As somebody that's lived in Jacksonville and heard about the Emerald Necklace or Emerald Trails, we're calling it now, for quite some time, I'm so excited to see that this is finally happening.
It is really exciting. And I think that, you know, a lot of the points you brought up today, I hope resonate with people in terms of, you know, these are really holistic solutions, right? They're not, again, it's co-benefits here. So, you know, adding that natural meander is going to help with the sediment distribution, which is going to help with downstream, you know, flooding impacts and you know, so many other benefits of just slowing that water down, right? And giving it the space for it to go. And you know, all of this discussion that we have about flooding, it's about, you know, water being in places where we don't want it to be, but we need to give it the space and direct it to where we want the water to go, because we know that we have more coming. We know that we have more frequent storms lasting longer and more water coming out of them, as well as more water coming in from the ocean. So, you know, let's prepare and do it in a way that, again, we have co-benefits to all of these things. I wanted to, Patrick, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to have a question here for John?
Yes. Hi, John. I have a question. You guys are talking about green infrastructure earlier with like rain gardens and urban forests. Have you also seen living coastlines being included in these kinds of plans to reduce the amount of like water that you're like the event of like a storm surge and such that you're seeing, like to lower that tidal margin you're seeing?
Yeah, so it depends on the setting. So when we look at Mccoy's Creek, it's going into a big drowned valley portion of the St. Johns River, right? But if it was going to the coast, you know, things like coastal marshes and barrier islands and oyster reefs all become part of a layered solution, right? And adding that living shoreline component along the coast. As far as, you know, natural channel design goes, the entire channel margin is a living shoreline, right? If you're doing it the way you know, that we're
Right.
defining it. And so that has some water quality benefits. It has tremendous habitat benefits, and it's a really important part of the overall stabilization of the valley, to have that vegetated edge and get your channel widths and depths correct. So they all work in concert to kind of hold the system in place. And we don't have tremendous amounts of creek meander over time in Florida streams, mainly because of how powerful our vegetation is with a year-round growing season just about everywhere across the peninsula for sure. You know, we just have this super strong vegetation holding the banks together. And so we have comparatively low sediment yields to our valleys, let's say, versus the Midwestern United States. So that combination means our fluvial forms are generally more stable than we find in the rest of the nation. But if you, surprisingly large amount of my rural work comes about because somebody decided that they didn't need the forest border along the creek. They either wanted a better view of the creek, and one of my mentors' favorite sayings is, yeah, people that try to get a better view of the creek by clearing the woody vegetation, then the creek gets a better view of them. So so you can unlock a lot of instability if you clear the living shoreline along a creek. So some of our projects are just, reestablishing that and rebuilding the shoreline and vegetating it. And there's very particular techniques for doing that, so that, just from day one, it's stable and you give time for the roots to get established. But and those are soil bioengineering approaches to shoreline stabilization, which is kind of a broad umbrella over the whole living shoreline concept, Patrick. But in the case of Mccoy's, coastal living shoreline really wasn't relevant to the setting. We did look at, and we talked to the private property owner that the mouth of the new Mccoys will go through. And they own some of the bottoms on the St. Johns River, but it was just a bad setting for anything that we were contemplating there, because it's at a bend. It's in a heavily developed part of the river, and it would have been just exceedingly, the return on investment really wouldn't have been there. It was exceedingly expensive to do it, and there would have been a benefit, but the cost to benefit ratio is way, way too high to justify it. So we're very happy that the city's investing many tens of millions of dollars in the creek restoration, and that'll be sufficient.
Well, thank you, John, for joining us today, for lending your expertise to this conversation. For anyone that wants to join us on our next episode, November 4th at 4 p.m., we'll be joined by Marissa Aho, Chief Resiliency Officer with the City of Houston, to talk about the Resilient Houston Strategy, which is a really, really great template and model that the City of Jacksonville and all of the counties along the St. Johns River watershed could benefit from. So tune in then, and thank you, Dr. Kiefer, for joining us today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everybody for joining in. I would encourage you too, that once we send out the recording of this, share it with your friends and colleagues and family, because I think this is a really important message about some of the ways, I mean, not just this show, but some of the other previous River Rising episodes as well, because these are really important conversations that need to be had in our community. And we need to start thinking a little differently about the way that we're approaching sea level rise and climate change. And I appreciate you, Dr. Kiefer, for all your great work.
Thank you. It's a fun way to make a living.
All right, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye.
All right.
Bye, y'all.